Okay. All right, there we go. All right, thank you so much. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no problem. So I do have a little bit of structure to my presentation tonight, but especially towards the end, kind of once I finish going over the nitty-gritty that I have here, I'm happy to kind of answer any questions about AAC in general, or help to brainstorm or mind map or talk through some things too, while we're here together, even if it's not specifically dedicated to AAC evaluations or the process related to that specifically. So this is a good time too to also, if you, like I said, if you have any questions like that, I'm happy to help. This is something that I kind of do on a daily basis in my work for TechAL, is I set up meetings, or families set up meetings with me, and we can kind of talk through some problems and see what types of AAC solutions we can come up with together. So about me, my name is Hali Strickler, and I am the AAC Services Coordinator for TechAL Pennsylvania. TechAL is Pennsylvania's state assistive technology program. I have a slide dedicated to some information and background about our programs. So TechAL is a part of the Institute on Disabilities at Temple University. So a long title. We are a part of the Institute on Disabilities, which is a more public-facing program of Temple University. We do a lot of outreach and different programs for individuals with disabilities throughout the state, as well as somewhat on a national platform as well. We are part of the University Centers for Excellence on Developmental Disabilities, or UCEDS. So that is what the Institute is. But then specifically, we are, as TechAL, the AT Act program for Pennsylvania. So there is a federal AT Act that says every state needs to have a program, or every state and territory is supposed to have an AT program, and we're Pennsylvania's. So I am a double graduate of Temple. It's like I never left. So I went to Temple for my undergraduate and my my master's in speech pathology. I am licensed to practice speech language pathology in both Pennsylvania and New Jersey. And I also have my certificate of clinical competence from the American Speech Language Hearing Association, or ASHA. If I refer to it later in the presentation, I'll probably call it ASHA. And so my full-time job, I am an AAC services coordinator. So I do AAC kind of all day, every day. But then I also do private practice speech pathology work here in the state of New Jersey. And I say here because that's where I live and that's where I am right now. So just some disclaimers I like to give before I present in any capacity at all. I am speaking from the perspective of a speech language pathologist and someone who practices as an AAC specialist. So my perspective might be different than some other folks, especially folks who practice or their expertise is in other types or other areas and professions. That doesn't mean that the perspective that I'm coming from is the end all be all, but this is just one kind of school of thought or way of thinking. And typically when I work with somebody, I say whatever works for them. I like to shape my practice and the work that I do with what works best for the individual. And that's a part of evidence-based practice that we should do. We should take the preferences and the experiences of the client, the student, the child, and their family as well when we're working with those individuals. Another thing I like to mention too is that it is important to listen to the voices of self-advocates and others in the disability community regarding these types of topics and conversations, so we can learn more from their lived experiences and perspectives. I am not an AAC user, so my lived experience is that of somebody who works with AAC users. So I think it is always good to listen to self-advocates in the community for more insight and information. And I will also use a variety of both identity first and person first language. So you might hear me use a little bit of that. The reason that I do that is to accommodate both preferences. A lot of times some folks do have identity first preferences, especially autistic adults in the neurodivergent community do have said that that is the preferred language, but then some other individuals do prefer that person first, like child with autism, to refer to individuals as. So I'll use a combination of both just to be inclusive. So again, TechAL, we are the state assistive technology for Pennsylvania. Our kind of old name was Piat, and now we've kind of rebranded as TechOwl. I have the link here to our programs. I kind of went over a little bit of this information, but we are kind of the overseeing or the umbrella program for the state of Pennsylvania. If anybody likes TikTok and uses that, we have a great TikTok page for TechOwl PA. I would think we're actually the number 2, don't quote me on this, but the number 2 most followed Temple related account. Hopefully we're number 1 soon because some of my colleagues are doing a lot of really good work. So if you're interested in assistive technology or anything disability related, our social medias are something that are really good to follow and hear kind of what's going on, especially in the Philadelphia area. We do a lot of posting related to that. So just some of our projects here on the slide are a few of my colleagues, Julianne with her guide dog, Bob, my colleague, Tom, who runs the TikTok, as well as Katie, who is our lending library coordinator. So the lending library is one of the big programs here at TechOwl. You will hear me refer to this later in the presentation. So the lending library is a free resource for anyone in the state. You don't have to be a person with a disability. You can be a parent, you can be a teacher, a speech pathologist, anyone who's working with somebody, or if you're just interested in borrowing these types of assistive devices to test out and try out. We like to say try before you buy, and this can be a good way to borrow AAC equipment to try out and see if that works for your child or your student. We have dedicated devices. It might not be the most recent version, but it can be a kind of like a little taste to see if this is the direction we want to go in. We also do have, I like to say, more iPads than we have copies of apps. So especially for a lot of the really popular AAC apps, we can send them loaded onto an iPad so that your student or child can try that out and see if that's a good fit. If they need a key guard, so like a grid overlay on a device screen, we can 3D print one of those for them to try out as well. And if you're interested in getting something made, that all the way at the bottom of the slide is our Create Together program. So we do a lot of different kind of creative projects to create assistive technology for folks. So here's just a list of some of our things that we do. I am going to point out one of our big ones here is ACEs. So ACEs stands for Augmentative Communication Empowerment and Supports. This historically is a 2-week program that's on Temple's campus for young adults who use AAC devices. So we are actually offering ACEs, this in-person 2-week experience this coming July in 2023. But we do require folks to be at least 18 because they are coming to Temple's campus. It is a college. But this is a really good experience for young adult AAC users or soon to be graduating students as well to really come and take classes in their communication device to learn different life skills or information for employment or independent living, all kinds of different things. We're kind of reworking it. We're working with some AAC users themselves to help better construct our program. And we also do some different online trainings as well. In the past, we've done one that's about talking with doctors and self-advocacy in the medical setting for your AAC device, as well as communicating about relationships and healthy sexuality with your AAC device as well. So just a quick overview, a little bit about what is AAC. This acronym stands for Augmentative and Alternative Communication. So a lot of words. Augmentative, meaning it augments, it adds to somebody's communication. So this might be a device that they use in addition to their voice or other types of communication modalities. Alternative stands for something that replaces somebody's speech. Most folks use a variety of different communication methods. So we kind of just use the AAC as that umbrella term because sometimes we're augmenting, sometimes we're alternative-ing, if that's a word too. So AAC basically includes any communication method that is outside of what we think of as oral speaking or talking. So this can really include our gestures, facial expressions, writing, drawing, using emojis, sending a text or an email. If we are spelling and pointing to pictures or picture cards that are printed out, or if we're using a speech generating device as well, those are all different forms of AAC. And in fact, we use AAC all of us every day. If you're giving a thumbs up, you're nodding or smiling, that is AAC. If you're using sign language, that's a form of AAC. And if you're writing in the chat, that too can be considered AAC too. And here on the slide is a picture of a few of our ACES alumni at Temple's campus. So all three of these young men are ACES alumni, and they are all AAC users using some sort of device. Some of them are using dedicated systems, and the gentleman in the foreground is using an iPad system that he was trying out for scanning. So the button near his head was what controlled his device. So here's just some examples of different AAC systems that you might see or that we might talk about throughout the evening. So AAC, I kind of have them in an order that I'm going to talk about. And AAC, we kind of refer to things as low or light tech. I tend to use the word light tech to describe things that don't have batteries, that they're not computerized, they're not an iPad. So things that are the two here, we have one that's the blue binder with the picture cards Velcroed onto it. You might hear the phrase PEX cards. That stands for Picture Exchange Communication System, something like that. Sometimes we use PEX cards to kind of just refer to any type of picture card system. But PEX in itself is actually the brand name of a specialized protocol for implementing these types of picture cards. You can use the PEX cards without, say, the PEX protocol. So a lot of folks kind of use those terms interchangeably. But picture cards can be a great form of light tech for individuals. I have a gentleman that I work with. He's in his 30s and he has a collection of over 200 picture cards. Some of them are in a box, some of them are in his binders, and some are hanging up in his home. But that's his preferred method of communication. That being said, it doesn't mean because he uses light tech that that's a lesser system. It just means that it's the right system for him. Even though we might call it low or light tech, it doesn't mean that you have to kind of master this level before you move to mid-tech or high-tech systems. Even though we look at it kind of on like a spectrum, one doesn't necessarily mean it's intrinsically better than the other. It just means that it's a high-tech system. It's using high technology. So to compare that, we also have the mid-tech devices. So those are going to be on the right, the top right of the screen. The red one is a Big Mac button, and the other one is a Go Talk device. So these use recorded speech. So somebody will have to talk to and record, and then when you hit the button or you press the button, it's going to say what's ever recorded. The one downside with this is that it's also recorded speech. So the voice of the speaker needs to match who's actually using the device. If we're using it with a little one, that might not matter as much because they might be, just working on that back and forth and that cause and effect with language access. But if you have a 15-year-old boy in high school who's using one of these devices, he definitely doesn't want to sound like me. So we might want to have a peer or a male teacher record their voice onto that device so it feels more authentic for that person. So that is one of the downsides to one of these, is that it does require a recording of a voice. And if you want to switch it up, you're going to have to change that recording. So down on the bottom are some examples of what we call those high-tech systems. So these are going to be devices that are computerized and use synthesized speech, so that computer voice. A lot of these computer voices can be really, really cool, like really good quality now. You might have seen videos of Stephen Hawking back in the day. He used an AAC device to communicate, and he had that very robotic voice. He could have picked a different one to use as the technology advanced, but he liked his old school system, and that's okay too. But the devices here on the far left on the bottom, the white one, is an iPad. So this is what we call a bundled iPad. So that's going to be an iPad with a case and a specialized communication app. The app that is on this particular iPad is called Touch Chat. So then another device here, this is just a basic Windows type tablet. I believe it is a smart box device. So that's just the name of the company. And the language software that they use on their devices is called Grid. This is also available on iPads as well. It's just a different layout or organization of the vocabulary. And then on the far right on the bottom is a Tobii eye gaze device. So it doesn't necessarily have to be an eye gaze one, but this type of device is set up for eye gaze, so someone can control it just with moving their eyes. And the language software that's on the screen is called TD Snap, as in Tobii Dynavox Snap. So it features, well, actually all of these devices on the bottom are going to feature vocabulary that consists of what we call core vocabulary. So these are really high frequency words that we use to build sentences. So things like want and stop and go and our prepositions and our pronouns. All those types of things we can use across our entire day to produce sentences and unique sentences as well. We can kind of get more bang for our buck using these types of words. And they make up about 80% of what we say, at least in American English as well. So a lot of these devices tend to have a similar kind of framework or look about them, but they can all be completely customized too, for the most part. Of course, there are some pros and cons to each of these systems, especially when we're comparing it to the needs of an individual who's using them. But at the end of the day, a lot of these devices can kind of do the same thing. So if we were having this conversation maybe 10 years ago when the iPad first came out, one app might have been a little better or had some features that the other app didn't, but now so much, a lot of them are really going to do the same thing. I tend to say when I'm evaluating somebody that a lot of times it comes down to how someone's language is organized and how they can navigate the device themselves, or how their language is organized in their own head. We're not going to know until we try and see what works. And then also aesthetically, sometimes we just don't like the way one works and it makes more sense to us. I worked with a mom last week and her kiddo was doing so well. She was a little one, 3 years old, was doing so well with an app that had 80 buttons on it or 84 buttons on it. And she was going really fast with it. But to mom, it just didn't make sense, that layout. She couldn't understand how the words were organized. And this one over here, the touch chat app, made a lot more sense to mom. But we sat down and we kind of talked about, well, it makes more sense to us because we have literacy skills. We have fully developed language already. She's 3. She doesn't have literacy skills. She's learning her language too. So what might make sense to us as a communication partner or a parent or a teacher might not actually make sense to the individual using that device too. And that's just something to keep in mind as well as we go on talking about this evening. So who can use AAC? I really like to say, in a lot of the other big names and like researchers in AAC always say there's no prerequisites. There are going to be some skills that might help you initially do better, but just because you might not have learned those skills yet doesn't mean you have to wait to develop them. For example, the ability to have a back and forth or in conversation or have cause and effect. We don't have to wait for those skills to develop before you can say graduate to get an AAC device. We can work on those things as we are accessing the communication, accessing that AAC system too. We can use the AAC system to help also teach those skills and maybe in particular lessons or activities too. So there's no prerequisites. Usually we say you have to be breathing or you just have to be alive to be able to use one. And I kind of already mentioned that AAC can really help support learning and development of new skills. We know that language impacts our thinking, it impacts our cognition and vice versa. So if we're giving a child access to language, that's going to help them really learn all of these new skills and further develop. We also know that students are going to need to be able to communicate for success in school, whether that's getting your basic needs met in school to be able to communicate, or if that's learning more complex or even abstract academic concepts, you're going to need language and a back and forth and vocabulary and all of those things to be able to be successful in school. So we don't want to deprive or limit a child or a student with access to language. We want to ensure that they have access to that language so they in turn can have access to the curriculum as well as other skills that are functional for the rest of their life, essentially. A lot of times we hear the phrase presume competence, but we all in our own lives, there are certain things that we are not going to be confident in. Like I can't do math to save my life, and that's okay. But I could learn with the right supports and the right things that I need being met, I can learn those things. So I like to say that we want to presume that everyone has the ability to learn, that we are presuming that they, with the right supports and access to things that they need, they're going to be able to learn those new skills and develop, say, language, or, the ability to do music or whatever that person wants to do. So we like to presume the ability to learn. And of course, communication is a human right. It helps us get our needs met, and it helps us relate to other people. And at the end of the day, communication is really about connecting with others. It goes back to being social. It goes back to learning new things and getting our basic human needs met too. So one of the big things that I say is that communication is for connection, not compliance. So just some myths about AAC that I'm going to bust here a little bit. So a lot of times I hear from parents, that they're concerned that AAC is going to prevent their child from developing natural speech, or that it's going to interfere with their language development. And all of the research shows that AAC is going to improve a child's ability to develop language. And if they do have a physical ability to produce, that there's nothing going on that's preventing them from a neurological or physical standpoint, that it can help them with their speech development too. So sometimes I hear too, they're too young for AAC, and that we have to wait till somebody's school age. Absolutely not. The earlier, the better. Little ones, especially birth to 5, that is a really, key time for little ones to access language and to gain new skills. So we want to make sure that we are giving them every capacity that they can to learn how to communicate during that time frame. A lot of times when I'm working with parents directly, I say that, we're getting them this device now, and best case scenario is that they're getting it, and this is something that then maybe they don't need, but they need it now, and they might grow out of it down the road. That's okay. Then worst case scenario is that maybe they do need it, but we're setting them up for success with their language system and a way to communicate from an early age. It's something that's going to grow with them throughout their life. So either way, even though I said it's a worst case scenario, that's really not a worst case scenario. That's a win for that child, that they've had access to language from, say, day one for them to communicate. And then I've already talked about this too, that a child must have skills like cause and effect or communicative intent before we introduce AAC. And really, there's going to be no prerequisites for AAC intervention, that we know AAC can really help them build these skills and also develop more functional communication abilities. So in terms of an AAC evaluation, I tend to look at AAC evaluations, at least in the work that I do, as like an informal type evaluation or a more formal evaluation. So informal, I look at as more of a consult that we know AAC is going to be for this person, and we are just trying out different solutions in their day-to-day life and seeing what works for them. In the school system, though, we're probably most likely going to go through a more formal and kind of regiment type of evaluation. It's going to have more structure and also more folks involved, especially for younger children, especially children too who aren't going to have a device. So really with this AAC evaluation, we want to use it to identify a child's current communication modalities. We want to look at it to see like what's working, what's not working, so their strengths and areas of needs, as well as any kind of systemic barriers that might exist. So maybe there's issues in the classroom that's preventing their communication, or maybe there's something going on at home too. We can look at the holistic view of the child to really kind of see how they're communicating. Because sometimes too, for example, I've worked with a little girl once who communicates successfully at home, but because of social anxiety, she had a diagnosis too of selective mutism. She was not able to communicate at school. And so at school, that's where an AAC, and that was impacting her education, her ability to communicate with her peers, the ability to talk to her teachers. So that's where AAC for this kiddo came into play, even though she was successful at communicating at home. So we want to make sure that we're looking at the whole child too. So we might use this evaluation then to kind of, once we get that kind of baseline down, like who is this kiddo? What are their strengths? Where do we want to go from this? Then we kind of want to explore the different types of AAC options that are out there. So that might be strategies that maybe it's sign language for that child. Maybe it's supporting the communication methods that they're currently using, but maybe we're also looking at different devices or systems or a combination of all three of these things. In my practice, I tend to support the use of total communication. We tend to use that all on a daily basis. That sometimes it's a gesture, sometimes it's a text, sometimes it's an email that we're using to communicate. So with that, we kind of, and we're looking at a student who uses AAC, we want to make sure that maybe we're honoring all of their communication methods. Sometimes a child might vocalize, sometimes they might point to their picture card or give a gesture. We then want to honor all of those attempts too as well. So this evaluation can help identify those solutions, and maybe it helps to narrow down the type of device based on the child's individual needs or preferences as well. And then the ultimate goal, I would say, of this AAC evaluation is to, one, determine if AAC is in fact the right way to go for this student, and then also what type of device or system or strategy does the team need to implement in order for them to be successful. So do have a note here. So a formal evaluation is needed for insurance to fund a speech generating device. What I mean by a more formal one is an evaluation that is conducted by a speech language pathologist. So whenever we're talking about insurance, a speech pathologist needs to complete that evaluation report. Their signature is the one that's going to matter when you're filing to get insurance to cover that device. So the objectives of any AAC evaluation, kind of already covered this too, but we also want to look into things like what types of tools, or we might hear the word features as well. So what types of things does this child need to be successful with their system or with their communication? So for example, if I have a child with a complex body, maybe they have difficulty with fine motor, I know that maybe using a touchscreen device isn't going to be the best option to start for them. So because they can't physically interact with that device using their fingers. So then maybe I want to narrow it down to, can they use a system with some sort of external device? Maybe they can hold a stylus to interact with the screen. But if their fine motor maybe can't support that use, then I want to look at other access methods. And that's where kind of working with somebody who has AAC knowledge or assistive technology expertise might come into play. So since this is what I kind of do every day, I like to say I make it look easy. So like off the bat, I know, okay, if a child can't use their hands to interact with the device, then I know I want to look at something that we consider alternative access. So maybe they're using their eyes to navigate the device. Maybe they're using an external switch. So maybe a button or something that they can grip, or even something that can register the movements of their neurons. Even though it doesn't look like they're moving, there's technology out there that can register the intention of movement now too. So we can narrow it down that way. But then kind of that knowledge in this area comes into play, that I know then, okay, I might want to rule out iPad-based systems just because they tend to be a little wonky when we plug something third party into them. Then that kind of helps me narrow down what types of devices to go in. So sometimes this, if we're unsure, this is when it's good for a team or families to maybe talk to somebody outside. So maybe a speech pathologist, an AAC specialist, somebody who has expertise in this area to help them kind of navigate what avenue we want to go down. We also want to make sure that the communication system is really going to be a long-term solution, especially when we are looking at insurance funding. You can only get a device funded every 5 years or so. through insurance. And this is something that I talk to a lot with families. I had this conversation this morning actually with one. We were looking at like the buttons to press, the mid-tech devices, and they were potentially interested in using insurance for that. Well, their child was 2. And if we're using your insurance money on something like that, then maybe this isn't going to be a long-term solution for a 2-year-old. We're not sure where they're going to be tomorrow, let alone a year from now, because little guys are going to learn language so fast. They're going to learn all kinds of new skills. We're not going to be able to predict the future. Like I said, tomorrow is going to be a brand new day for that little one. So I don't want to use their insurance money to pay for something that I don't anticipate being a more long-term solution. Going from 2 to 7, there's a big difference there. There's lots of opportunity for learning and growth. So I want to make sure that whatever we're getting is going to be robust and it's going to have the capacity to grow with them. And so that's a con of some devices. Some devices, just because of their nature, like a recordable device, isn't going to necessarily be able to grow with an individual. It can meet your needs now, and that's a great thing if that's the right fit for you now, but that's something we want to keep in mind, especially in terms of our funding sources, because sometimes that is a little bit limited. So the evaluation process, we want to start with information gathering. And then we want to kind of take that information and then go into different devices and system trials. And then we're going to take the system trial results, the data from that, and we're going to say, okay, this device was the most successful, or maybe none of these were, and we have to revisit the information gathering stage. But then at the end, we're going to go through funding and obtaining AAC, especially if we are deciding as a team that AAC is recommended for this individual. So just kind of a disclaimer here, this is traditionally how I recommend going through the process. Every professional and organization and system might do things a little differently. Some school districts are going to have a specific process in place too. So it might look a little different, but from kind of just an umbrella perspective, this tends to be the order that a lot of different organizations do. For me personally, as a speech pathologist, when I do my AAC evaluations, I like them to be longer. So a lot of times in special education, when a child is, say, getting a reevaluation for their IEP, they're taking a standardized test, and it's kind of like a once and done type of thing. It might take a couple days to get that test done, but it's kind of, that's the snapshot, that's what we have. When it comes to an AAC device, that snapshot doesn't really tell me a lot about what you're doing, especially if, say, a lot of times I come in as an outside person, and if I see what a kiddo's doing for an hour with me, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be the right fit for them every day in the classroom or every day at home. We want to make sure that the system is going to meet the needs of them and of the child in all of their contexts with all of their communication partners. Of course, a perfect solution doesn't always exist. Sometimes, we're going to find one that works better than the rest. It might not be 100% perfect, and we can steal ideas from other systems too to apply them to the one that we decide to go with. But I tend to view the evaluation process as something that's kind of over a longer period of time rather than just one particular date. So the information gathering part. So to get started, your team, the IEP team or the school team might hold a set meeting. So a set meeting isn't necessarily going to be like a fancy legal type IEP meeting, but this is a meeting that the team can kind of come together to really start to identify AAC and to kind of start that discussion. So SET stands for Student Environment Tasks and Tools, and this was developed by the late Dr. Joy Zabala. So this really is going to look at the students. So what are their strengths? What are their needs? The environment, where are they communicating? Are they at school? Are they at home? Do they really need to, maybe they're in high school and they go to a vocational site during the day. They need to be able to communicate there as well. We also want to look at the tasks. What type of things does the student need to do? What do they need to communicate about? A lot of times, that's going to be the same thing. They need to communicate about their needs. They need to communicate about the lessons, ask for help, talk about their day, things like that. But then maybe if we look back at that high schooler, they need to be able to communicate, with their job coach, or maybe they're working with the public and they're, I don't know, taking orders at a coffee shop, something like that. They need to be able to communicate that type of task as well. And then the tools, what kinds of assistive technology or tools or solutions have we used in the past? What things have worked? What things have didn't? What do we know that they need? Maybe if they have physical needs or vision needs, we also want to look at those things. So this is really kind of a framework or an umbrella that we can use to organize our information, talk about the needs of the student, and then also the features of the existing technology and devices that are out there on the market. This can kind of help us narrow down which systems we want to consider. So if we go back to the example of the child with the complex body that I had talked about a couple slides back, we know that if they have a complex body, that their physical access is going to be impacted. So we can automatically rule out a chunk of devices. So then we're not wasting that student's time, and that we're also not giving them something that they're not going to be able to use. That's frustrating. Nobody wants to do that. So then we're narrowing it down with systems that we can actually consider for that individual. So we want to consider all kinds of things about the student. So everything from physical access all the way to their attention or their executive functioning. And so when I talk about attention and executive functioning, I'm not necessarily looking at that from a competency approach. I'm looking at that more of, is having 84 buttons on the screen too much to look at compared to maybe 20? Maybe we do better at navigating 20. It doesn't mean that we're going to have less words on our system. It just means maybe we perform better, or we're able to navigate our device better with a smaller grid size. I know off the top of my head, the one device, the touch chat app, I think one of their default sets goes up to 140 buttons or icons at once. I have no idea. That frustrates me. So I can't imagine. I know some folks who do use it and it's great for them. I say power to them, because I couldn't do that. So that's kind of the limit for me personally, my attention. To be honest, I probably couldn't do the 80 either. I'm probably looking more at the 60 buttons, because I think that attention wise, that's all I could handle and be able to visually scan at once. And that's okay. It doesn't mean one's lesser or one's better than the other just because it's more. It just means it's the right one for me as the individual. So really, we're going to take this information from that set meeting with the whole team. So this is of course going to be the student, especially if they're older. We want to include them in the process. This is their device. They have the right to be included. From day one, we want to include the family as well as teachers, everyone, staff. Yes.
That was going to be my question. I know I would want to be involved, but inviting the family from day one when they're talking about their child, because we're not talking about just school, we're also talking about home and community.
Yes,
Right.
absolutely. Because you don't turn, and that's, I think, one of the big things too. This is more of like a systemic issue, I think too, that I do find that it is getting better, that in the past we've heard horror stories of that the device is for school only and it stays at school. Well, your communication doesn't stop at school. And you need to be able to communicate to have access to the curriculum. That's part of your FAPE, your free and appropriate education, public education. You need to be able to communicate about school at home and continue working on those skills at home. So I think that the parents should be involved if they want to be involved in that process too.
That systemic issue still happens today.
Yes, definitely. And my argument that I like to use too is that, well, we make kids bring homework home. If we're going with that, why? So if we're kind of applying the same logic, like if this child's, because they have an IEP and their goal, their big focus at school is working on their communication skills. So all of a sudden now we don't need to do our homework. We don't need to communicate and continue our learning. Then that means everybody else in the classroom, nope, you don't need to continue your education at home either. It stops at 3 o'clock at the end of the day. We don't communicate, we don't think about school, but that's not the reality of the situation. So that should apply to our students who use devices as well. But I'm probably preaching to the choir here. um,
You would be surprised. Parents don't know, because I've actually had parents who are like, well, the school said I can't take it home. And I'm like, no, actually you can, because
yeah,
your child needs to be able to communicate, not just in school, but at home in a community.
yes.
Right. So
And I've also seen horror stories of the reverse, that a family has received a device prior to the child coming to school, or they're moving into a new school district with their device. And the school says, oh no, well, you can't bring that here. We can't have that. We have to get them something different, because the school partially, they don't want to be responsible for the $40,000 eye gaze device with all the fancy bells and whistles. Which I get, nobody wants to be responsible for the device that costs as much as a car, but the school isn't going to say that to the child who's using a hearing aid or using a wheelchair. Oh, we don't want to be responsible for your wheelchair, so you don't get to walk at school, or you don't get to hear at school. They're not saying that to them, because then it becomes a civil rights issue. And I try to advocate for more, well, we should apply that same kind of energy to our communication devices, that if you're being denied your communication device, now this is a civil rights issue, not an education issue.
I had that happen with a kiddo who was transitioning from like 3 to 5 to school age, and he was using eye gaze, and the school issued a permission to evaluate. And I said, but why? He's using the eye gaze and he's doing really well with it. Why would we not continue? And it really came down to the fact that the team was not well versed. And I said, well, supports for school personnel, right? Let's open up that IEP. Let's bring a specialist in who's well versed to help guide the team.
Absolutely. Because not everybody's going to be an expert on everything. And I talk about AAC and I do AAC all day, and I don't know how to use half of these devices, especially they're constantly being updated. The software, I get calls from families and individuals too. They're like, I don't know what's going on with my device. And I'm like, well, I don't know either, because it's a computer issue and I'm not a computer person. So I'm on the phone with tech support just like the next person. That's okay. We can even make time in the IEP too to connect with the vendors and the sellers of these devices, because they're going to know the ins and outs. I actually got a school set up with a vendor. We're going to do like a demo with them in a couple weeks with this really fancy expensive device, so that this child can try out this equipment, but I'm looping the vendor in because I have no idea how to set it up, and I want to get him the most bang for his buck with trying out this device. And me pretending to know how to set this up and where to put it on his body, that's going to be a waste of his time. Let's call in the person that actually knows how to really set this up so you can get the best trial for something. I know not everybody likes to admit when they don't know. I tend to be one of those people. I'm like, I don't know, let's call in the expert. So here's just some more information about teams and your potential roles in the set process, but also throughout the evaluation. I like to think that this is something that it goes in waves. Just because the set process is over doesn't mean that we're not considering these things throughout the evaluation. So the teacher, they want to be kind of thinking about how the device and language is being used at school. We're going to start implementing different visual supports, and we're going to start modeling language. And this also kind of overlaps into direct support professionals, paraprofessionals, whoever else is working with that student at school, and seeing how they're doing, tracking that data, whatever data we want. Maybe it's them selecting an icon. Maybe it's that they're even looking at the device. It just depends on the student and where they're at during this process. How we're tracking the data is going to look different for each child. The speech pathologist, maybe they're initiating that borrowing of equipment or getting that equipment set up, and they're maybe training the rest of the team members, kind of being that go-to person for the equipment during this trial and evaluation. Maybe we're looping the OT and the PT in to really talk about access and positioning, especially for those students with the complex bodies and fine motor needs. We want to make sure that we're considering any types of accessories that they might need along with their device. And then the parents too, you want to make sure that you're offering input into what kind of vocabulary is really needed for your child to be successful because we're not just using this to talk about icebergs and peninsulas and science and gym class. We're also using this to talk about our routines at home. We're not just using the word go to talk about going to the cafeteria, going to our locker, other things. We're also using it at home to go to the grocery store, go to church, go to bed, all of those types of things as well. And then parents too, when that device comes home, we want to make sure that we're continuing to carry over any of that modeling that's being done at school, or maybe we're checking the device to see, was it used? There are ways with certain devices too to set it up to see what types of words were used throughout the day. We're also making sure that it's charged and it's in the student's backpack too to go to school. And that's something that the teachers and school staff too can ensure, that the device is charged. That in itself could even be a goal for a child or a student to do, to take responsibility. We call that operational competence, that they're learning how to operate their system as well. And of course, I have a note here at the bottom that there might be other types of professionals or other members of the team, like a vision specialist, depending on what that student's needs are. So information for the evaluation, especially a formal evaluation that's going to go to insurance. Probably up until about this year, my speech generating device evaluations that went to insurance were clocking in from 17 to 22 pages long. But some of the vendors have now made that a little easier to get that paperwork in. But regardless, all of these things are still the same. We still need to have that case history. So that's parents. That's where a lot of your expertise is really going to come in. What is going on? What is the background of this child? Especially what are things that have been tried in the past as well? If we're using insurance to fund a device, we need to know about medical history, and all of that information. We're also going to look at all of their needs and all of their areas. So looking at the child holistically, everything from their physical abilities up to their speech and language, as well as any types of cognitive assessments too. All of that information is needed in an insurance submission. But then we're going to look too at the specific devices. We're going to rule devices in, and we're also going to rule those devices out, and we need to be able to justify why. I have had, very complex data with number of uses, number of icons hit, and that they were able to, put two words together using device A, but they weren't able to, they had a harder time navigating like device B. So we're using that data numerically to demonstrate that device A is better. But then I've also had the child wouldn't even look at device B. And that is a good enough reason to rule it out. Sometimes it's just the way it looks, or there's something about the screen that you just don't like. And that's okay too. And if they're not going to use it and we don't have the data to it, but they're looking at something else, they're more engaged with another system, then we don't want to waste the child's time with something that they're not interested in or that's not going to work for them. We can always revisit that, but we want to make sure that we're giving them the most time with the device or system that they're showing the most success and that maybe they're most interested in too. Sometimes it does come down to just preference with these systems as well. So for trials, where to borrow devices. So for short-term loans, you can borrow from TechAL Pennsylvania. This is a free program, so anyone can borrow from our lending library. And then there's the Patan. They have their own lending library too but I believe you have to be from a school district to be able to borrow that equipment there. And I want to say that they run on the school year, but I could be wrong on that. Whereas at TechAL, we run all year. But then you can also borrow more specialized equipment or like the latest models of some of these more like complex devices, like an eye gaze system, from the specific vendors. So especially if you're working with a speech pathologist or an AAC specialist or an AT specialist, kind of the knowing where to borrow, that might be a good place to loop them in. Or sometimes you can just give us a call at TechAL. Most likely if it's an AAC question, you're going to be forwarded to me. And I can kind of give you some advice on who to borrow. Like if you're looking for an eye gaze device, and we kind of know what avenue we want to go down, I might recommend going with the vendor directly, just because you're going to get the latest model. You're going to be able to have it a lot sooner than our wait list for an older model at TechOwl. Just depends on the equipment. But when in doubt, I say give us a phone call and we'll help navigate you. We are device agnostic. We aren't going to sell you one way, but a vendor is. If you're trying out their device, you don't have to buy one, but they're going to try to give you some of that pressure to make a sale. Just keep that in mind. So once we have the device, what next? We want to make sure that we're modeling language. We're providing access to that device to give that student a fair chance at learning the system. Because in a way, when they're doing the trial, they're also kind of getting a little snapshot, a little taste of how to learn the system. How is it going to work in their everyday life as well as at school? In AAC, typically we start with a least to most prompt hierarchy. So I tend to try to avoid hand over hand or hand under hand as much as possible, unless a child is what I like to call like the hoverer, or they hover by the device and they're not actually touching it, but they're pointing to it. Sometimes they just need a little push just to kind of show it's okay to touch the device. Or if a child this is their first time with a piece of technology, sometimes we do need hand over hand just to learn how to use it physically, like to physically interact with the system. But usually we're going to start with those natural kind of conversational or environmental prompts. Like I'm going to say like, oh, how are you? And then wait and see how the child is doing. And then I might model on the device. That might be my next kind of prompt. Like, oh, you look happy today. And I press the word happy to demonstrate, and giving them those chances, but also modeling that language too. During these trials, we want to take any relevant data too. This can be anecdotal, qualitative and quantitative. Any and all information is really going to be helpful for us. We want to make sure that we're customizing too. So if there's something that's super motivating for that individual, we want to make sure we're putting that in there. If they love goldfish and they love the show Friends, we want to make sure we're including those things on the device for them to talk about. And then we want to make sure that as a team, we're all sharing the input. Sometimes the one device might be working at school, but it's not working at home. It's important to share that so that when we come together as a team, we can really discuss all the pros and cons and see what directions we want to go in. So funding and obtaining AAC, so who pays for it? So school districts, if it's in the child's IEP, they do have to provide the AAC. But if it is purchased with school district funds, there's a possibility that it does belong to the district. That then can start some problems if you move from district to district. It might mean that the child then has to kind of restart the process, because at the new school district, they want to reevaluate and see if this, holds true still. Or when they graduate, then they don't have a device. And I see that a lot with our adults in Philadelphia, that they graduate and now they don't have a device, and it isn't revisited until maybe 10, 15 years post-graduation. That is unfortunately a reality that we are seeing, and hopefully we'll start to kind of make, strides forward in that area. You can purchase a device using insurance. That device, then no questions asked, is going to belong to the child. But the school district cannot make you use your insurance. If their SLP or the district offers that says, hey, we can file through your insurance for this device, you have that option, but you also have the option to say no too, or you have the option to go outside of the district and use your insurance for another thing too. Yes.
How often can a parent or go through medical assistance to get a new AAC device? Is it every 5 to 7 years? What is the
It's typically every 5 years.
Okay.
That seems to be the standard. Sometimes if there's like an emergency or a really good reason, we can file, like especially if it's broken or something like that, we can file in advance before that, but there's a good chance that it's going to be denied and it's going to have to go through an appeal process. It really just depends on the insurance and who's reading the report that day, and what kind of games that they decide they want to play.
Yeah, appeals are always worthwhile though. Definitely.
Yes, absolutely. Because most of the time the appeal just means that the person didn't read the report. Because in my experience, I had somebody come back and say that I didn't include X, Y, and Z. And I'm like, yes, I did. It's on page 10. It's on page 13. It's on page all of this. Because they're not, to be honest, they're probably not reading these. They're looking for keywords, like they're looking for the word iPad, so then they can throw your report in the trash because you said iPad, so now we can't give you this. So I always say with insurance, it's worth a fight and it's worth a try. Because the worst they're going to say is no, and then we're in the same boat we already were. We didn't have it before, but we can then we got the final answer. Now we can either fight them a couple more rounds or we can go through another funding source, because a lot of times other funding sources, like especially if your child is 21 and they're on a waiver, they might need an insurance denial. Sometimes some grant programs as well are a payer of last resort. They're going to want to see a denial from your insurance too. So it really just kind of depends on the system. And also something to mention too, that if your copay, especially if you're looking for an iPad device, even though insurance won't call it an iPad, it's going to have a crazy name. That's not an iPad. It's still an iPad in a case with an app at the end of the day. If I have personally not seen this in Pennsylvania, but I have seen it, heard horror stories in other states of the copay being like $400 to $700 for one of these devices. And then at that point, you're better off taking that money that you pay for the copay and just going and buying an iPad and not playing the insurance game with that. But of course, every family situation is different. And so that's when it's good to kind of talk to the team about other funding options as well. But at least in Philadelphia, I have not, with medical assistance, I have not had anyone had to pay a copay, knock on wood, that I don't jinx myself. But it really depends on the insurance and kind of who's reading the report that day.
I have another question for you. Does David Gates help with this by any chance for families who are trying to use their insurance, or they're kind of getting the runaround, or even through waiver to get the AAC device? Is this something that Pennsylvania Health Law Project can help families with?
That I'm not sure. I'm not familiar with their work. That would be a good question. I'd be really interested in that answer.
All right, I'll have to find out. I'll let you know.
Yeah. Because I personally have not run into anything. And I typically, when I do my evaluations I'm on a contract with the city through our office. So we do evaluations for adults who receive waiver services. And I personally have not run into any issues. The only thing I've had to go outside of, say, insurance funding was for a gentleman who wanted more environmental controls. He wanted to be able to connect his AAC with Alexa and with a smart TV. Little ones in schools, absolutely. They're going to say, absolutely not. You don't need the TV at school. But when you're 30 years old, you are going to want those things for your everyday life and to be able to control that. Insurance is not going to cover that though. So that's when we look towards other grant types of funding. So I know I'm kind of over my 8 o'clock. I can keep going through my slides quick, or I can answer questions, or a combination. I'm a talker.
I'm loving it. I don't know how many more slides you have left.
I only have a handful.
Yeah, I'm loving it. If everybody's okay, if you can give me a thumbs up, that would be great. We can continue on. Or if you want to go into questions, that's fine too.
Or a combination. I'm
Yeah.
a therapist, so I talk a lot.
No, I think it's been great. So, well, we can continue on. And those that have to leave, don't worry. I put in the chat. You can email Lisa Johnson directly to get the PowerPoint.
Yes, I am sure I'll be sure to share that, to send that to you to share out with everybody. And I am always happy to, if you have to log off, you can find me at TechOwl, and I'll actually just put my email in the chat because it is on my last slide, but just in case, because I understand it is later in the evening and folks with the kiddos, sometimes you got to get them tucked in. So a bit more about the insurance process too. This is when you are going to need a SLP to complete a formal speech generating device evaluation. And this evaluation is going to look different than like an evaluation you get when your child is getting evaluated to qualify for speech therapy services in the school system. This is going to look really different. And I usually like to kind of warn my families and my clients themselves too, especially my adult clients, that you really don't want to read this report from me, because it's not nice. It unfortunately has to go from a very deficit-based approach, because we have to prove that this is medically necessary to have. Otherwise, if we give any inkling their, of success. We know from education that we're focusing on strengths, we're meeting the child where they are, but insurance doesn't care about any of that. They want to know that this is medically necessary and it's a last resort to pay for it. So I usually give folks a disclaimer like, hey, maybe just put it in your files. This again, it's not going to be a fun report to read because we are going from that. One of the big things is that we do have to write in the report that prognosis is poor. Otherwise insurance is going to be like, oh, there's a chance. We know there is a chance that this AAC is going to support your language and development. But the minute we say that, they're like, nope, we're not paying for this. So that's a kind of a disclaimer I like to put out there. And that's not just for me, that's for all SLPs. That's how it has to be to get these devices paid for. Additional paperwork as well. Oh, and another disclaimer, I usually say don't call up your insurance and ask who's in network, because then they're going to dictate which devices that you can go through. I find that it's better to kind of submit to the vendor that the team has chosen is the best choice, and then kind of dealing with it from there. Because the vendor is going to want to make a sale. They're going to deal with that insurance as much as they can to make that sale. A lot of times though, the insurance company is going to come back and say, oh, well, it's kind of like the equivalent of, well, you need a knee replacement, but we'll give you back surgery. That's not a match. Yes.
So I have had parents who've actually gone to, we'll say something like CHOP, right, or St. Chris, and they've gotten the AAC evals, which is fine. But there's that disconnect because we haven't included the school team in, right? How can a parent make sure that the school team is also included in that evaluation process, right? Because what happens in one setting, you might end up getting a device that your school team has no knowledge about whatsoever.
And I think like from some of the families that I've worked with too, that with CHOP as well, that sometimes it's kind of like a once and done situation as well. That then a lot of the follow-up does rely on the school team. I think looping them in, especially if things were trialed. And I think that's kind of going with that team approach, even too, if the parent has to kind of, if you're taking your kiddo to CHOP to get evaluated, if you have any information or set information from the school, trying to bring that for them to consider, and then vice versa as well. Also, it is really hard because a lot of the hospitals and rehab centers tend to be a once and done. It's kind of closed then. The case is closed once the evaluation's done, and now the school's left to doing the therapy. I think those are really hard. There isn't really a magic answer. I think it is kind of keeping that network open, and sometimes you have to be the go-between to facilitate that as a parent or an individual school member. I think that that's really hard. That's something too that I'm also I don't have a magic answer for.
Right. Well, I was thinking maybe parents could, since we go virtual now, right? You can invite maybe the CHOP speech language pathologist who's been doing the assessment to attend a meeting virtually with your school team. Because if you go through your medical assistants, kind of like you said, you're stuck with a device for 5 years. And if your school team doesn't know how to do it, how beneficial is it going to be?
Absolutely. I think that too, even like making sure up in advance that especially if there is like a designated, like say case history time, that then the CHOP person can meet with the school team and kind of talk through. And I have been kind of having this conversation with families more recently that best practice in speech therapy, usually we want to say like it's always based on the individual 100%. But sometimes the reality is that yes, there might be two or three systems that this child can really use, any of them or all of them. But sometimes the team or the teachers are gravitating towards one. Now, we want to make sure that it is being used and not sitting up on a shelf. And if a kiddo can handle both A and B, and there isn't a clinical reason that say me as the SLP really wants to fight for one, because sometimes there is a reason that I'm going to fight for one versus the other. But if there isn't, I really do in default let it up to the people that know the child best and know their routines best. Because a good chance too, if they're not necessarily gravitating towards anyone in particular, that they're going to be able to handle both A and B. So I'd rather see it being used than being in the backpack.
What about devil's advocate? A parent is looking for their child to maybe use sign language with vocal approximations that are, shaped over time, but you have a school team that's really, really pushing for the AAC device, right? Or vice versa. How much weight does a parent have when it comes to their child's AAC or their child's mode of communication?
I think it has to be a 50-50, but that's also, I think it does come down to individual perspective of the members on the team. If I was the person on the team, I'm a big total communication. I'm going to fight for all of it. Like, let's use all of it. Because if you're going to communicate, and this is just kind of human language in general, we're going to use whatever method is fastest. With my fiance, it's given him a thumbs up because he's not going to listen to my whole big long sentence. So I have to use what method is fastest to get my point across. If we're at home and we know that gesturing or using an approximation because mom and dad understand me or grandparents understand me, I'm going to use that. Why am I going to go get my device out of my backpack when I can use the sign I use at home with them? But my teacher or the gentleman at the coffee shop, they might not understand my gesture. So that's when I need to be able to use that device. And that might be a process that we're learning. We're learning that skill. Like, we use our gesture, it didn't work. Now what? And that's an ongoing skill that we might be learning. But that's the same thing. I might give my boss a thumbs up, but she's like, what the heck is that? Nope, I have to default. And now I'm going to kind of repair that. That in itself is a skill. And I think all AAC users, especially very proficient, native AAC speakers too, like if this is their first language, this is the language they've used their whole life, their primary language, even they sometimes have to like, oh, wait, they don't understand what I'm saying. But that's my perspective. And I know that that's not the reality that everyone faces. I do think when it comes to like the sign and gestures or vocalizations, not everybody, especially when you're a teenager or an adult, not everybody out in the community is going to acknowledge that or have the patience for that. And that is unfortunately something that folks do have to face. Children grow up. They're not children forever. In fact, we're not children for the majority of our lives, actually, and we want to make sure that we can communicate. And one thing too is that, especially with a lot of the adults I have some clients that I've worked with who are in their 60s, and their parents are in their 80s and 90s, and their parents know them best. But they're getting to the time now where if their parents are the only ones that they can communicate with, what's going to happen? They're going to have to be able to communicate or have something in place to do that. And then those gestures, especially maybe if we don't have them written down what they mean, that person's going to have a really hard time. They're not going to be able to communicate with the others in their life too, or have that person there to interpret.
You
I
are
hate to bring
preaching to
that
the
up.
choir.
I hate to bring that up because I know nobody wants to hear that. But I had an AAC user the other day tell me like, this is something that people really need to start talking about because it's really important. So I'm trying to be a little more like, yes, you're right.
That's what I tell a lot of my parents and a lot of my friends. I'm like, we need to plan for our death, right? And how our children are going to continue, right, with their mode of communication. So we have to make sure that they have access outside.
Absolutely. And that's too where, and when I write an insurance request, one of the sections, and I almost put this in every report, is that, say Johnny might use signs at home, but not everybody in his daily environments understands his signs. Therefore, this does not meet his functional communication needs. That's kind of the fancy language that I use, but all that means is it just doesn't meet his needs 100% of the time. And that's where we might want to look at other options. But I'm a big believer in let's use the device. Let's repeat after the device. Let's have a picture on the table. Let's sign along with it. The more the merrier, whatever works, let's use it. That's at least how I approach therapy. I like to say it's the correct way, but sometimes it's not. Depends on the child. But just here's a list of other things that you do need if you're pursuing insurance. But my big takeaway here is you need an SLP to submit that for you, and don't call your insurance first. So some considerations, I think we kind of covered some of these too, but this is kind of the flip side. So insurance, it needs to be medically necessary. For AAC at school, it needs to be educationally necessary. I think that communication should be medically and educationally necessary 100% of the time. Unfortunately, the system does not seem to agree with that, and so that's why we're here. But AAC, if it's needed, we want to make sure we're putting it in the IEP. We want to make sure that there are kind of different, we kind of think through everything in advance, kind of put on the lawyer hat for a second, or pretending to be a lawyer and thinking, what kind of loophole could they give us? So we want to make sure that the student can take the device home at night, say for homework, like I had talked about, or over the weekend or over the summer, because they need to work on those things. We don't want any regression of skills, because you need to communicate. AAC is like learning a second language. So especially if this is something that's being introduced maybe a couple years into your life, or when you're a teenager or an older child, you've already kind of developed your first language. Maybe you're bilingual too, and this is your third language now. We kind of have to approach it like that. If you think back to high school, if you didn't practice your French all summer, you're going to have a hard time the first couple months. And that's going to be the same thing with AAC. If you didn't have your AAC all summer, you're going to have a hard time come back to school, just like with any routine. We want to make sure that we're keeping that consistent. We also want to make sure that access, kind of advocating for that idea that access to AAC equals FAPE. So kind of use those key buzzwords, LRE, FAPE, throw that around. That's going to help get that in there. Other things I like to say is make sure that in the IEP that there's information written for like the staff to model, that you want this, if they have a paraprofessional, that para is modeling on the child's device, even if the child might not be necessarily at the stage where they're using it independently themselves yet, that they're modeling that language to give them that input, that stimulation.
When you say modeling, do you mean modeling with a device and language?
I say both.
I
So
like it.
when I'm modeling, like during, say, if I'm working with somebody, whether they're 3, whether they're 33, if we're at the stage where, first of all, you're going to let me touch your device and I don't have to have my own separate one, I'm going to, if we're talking about our feelings, I'm going to model like, I'm feeling, and maybe just happy, feel happy. That's where we're at. My expectation might be that maybe they just look at it. That's my goal, is that they look at the screen or they look at me. That might be my first goal. But then the next one is that maybe they identify one of the words, like, are you happy? And I hit happy on the device, or are you sad today? And hit sad. And maybe kiddo's still not hitting the button yet, but then I know they're happy. So I might model the word, you're happy today. Oh, that's nice. You're happy. We're having that conversation anyway. We're using that word happy when we're talking to them, if we're talking about feelings. So now I'm just throwing in the device as a way to kind of give visual language and a way for that child to respond back and get that reciprocal communication.
Is that more like incidental teaching? Kind of like what you're talking about? You do that incidental teaching per se?
Yeah, I would say so. I tend to look at it as more kind of conversational. We're already having conversations. I don't really give it like the big fancy term is like aided language stimulation. That we're kind of like almost, or like auditory bombardment in a way. Like we're kind of almost overkill. We're modeling on the device. If we're talking about our feelings, I'm doing it over and over again. Or if we're reading a book, I might use the word turn the page every time, or hit the button, turn the page every time we turn the page. And with the goal of it being eventually that then the child will start to respond and use the device too. I typically don't recommend hand over hand to force them to use it. I tend to go with a more naturalistic approach, but that of course is one of those, like, your audience. Sometimes, that child might need that support initially, but I think or they don't know how to interact with an iPad yet. That's okay. Then maybe we do that. It depends on the individual child, but as soon as they start to physically interact with it themselves, I back off. If I would have to do any sort of physical assistance.
Let me ask you this, prompt dependency. We talk about it in ABA. It's a very real thing. We find kids are really prompt dependent. They can't do anything without that prompt. Do you find that same thing with AAC devices where kids are prompt dependent?
I find that oftentimes we do see that, and part of it too is I think I don't really have any research to back this up, but I find it, I'm sure it exists, but I see it more of like the cases that I've worked with, that especially adults, that if we're introducing this now and they've been very prompt dependent their entire life and kind of waiting for people to ask them something or communicate, they're not going to interact with the device until they're encouraged to. And I think that then we have to kind of unlearn the prompt. And that's really hard because when you're an adult and you're 40 years old and you've expected something, it's done the same way your entire life, that sucks. You
Is
don't,
there,
you don't
yeah,
want
is
to
there a
relearn.
procedure in place? Like for example, if you're working with an AAC device, is there a procedure in place to address prompt dependency? Just out of curiosity.
Not a formal one that I'm aware of off the top of my head. That's something that I should research to see if there is anything in there, because I'd be really interested if there are studies that are looking at that. I know that this is something that a lot of SLPs kind of talk about. And I think that the way around it is that a lot of times, or at least the way I encourage my families and clients to work with, is we tend to focus on requesting first, and even from children to adults, because requesting is very motivating. It's kind of easy to teach too, in a way. Not easy in that it can be acquired quickly, but easy in that we can physically demonstrate it. You said cracker, now you get cracker, or you said you want to go, or me to go away, now I leave. You got what you wanted. That's motivating, that's empowering, and we can physically see it happening, cause and effect. But a lot of times we stop there, that the language learning just becomes variations of requesting, or variations of choice making, rather than kind of expanding onto other areas. Requesting and choice making are only a very small part of communication. If you think about it, if you just requested to your partner all day, every day, they're going to hate you by the end of it. We're saying so many other things in communication. And I think that one of the best ways to kind of counter that is maybe our expectation or our goal or objective for the student is that we're data tracking their requesting or their choice making, but maybe that choice making is in terms of commenting, or they're answering a question about something, but we're giving them two options with the device. We're modeling two options. In a way, they're making a choice, but they're not dependent on us to prompt them initially. Maybe we're giving them the visual, we're touching the device. Maybe then we're not touching the device and we're just saying, is it this or is it that? Or we're giving them a yes, no, and then we're just asking the question, or we're just commenting on it. I think it's not just limiting it as, do you want this snack? Do you want me to go? Do you want to wear blue? We're talking about, oh, this is nice. This is funny. I like this. Asking questions, talking about other things. I think, and a lot of it is more work for the teacher. It's more work for the parent, the communication partner, to model and show language in other ways rather than.
How about scrolling? Scrolling is a very real thing. I ask a question and they just kind of run through everything. They're just kind of hitting the buttons in the hopes of giving you what it is that you want, right? How do you address the scrolling?
I think that's a know your audience too. That's
Yeah, I know.
sometimes.
Sorry. I just,
Yeah,
all these questions I have.
that's okay. I think that that's a good one, because I think it would be, I can think of two ways. One, depending on the kiddo, I might be like, whoa. Like, to be honest, I might just tell them, okay, hold on, hold your horses, and we're going to talk about it. And we're going to say that was too much at once. If that's the level, we can have that back and forth. We can kind of break them in the scroll where they're at, or the scripting or whatever, and kind of, or bombard it, sabotage, or we can even sabotage the environment to kind of, we know they're going to do that, and help them find a way out of it. But again, that's more work on the communication partner initially to support that individual.
This is my favorite part of the slide,
Odd.
just so you know,
Oh,
because you're talking about goals and objectives. You're talking about supports for school personnel. You know,
yes.
I'm all about quantifying, right? So if we're going to teach the child X amount, I would like to be able to list what we're going to teach X amount, quantify the goal. What is the child going to walk away with? In addition to that, I love what's called generalization probes, right? So you've taught it in isolation, but can we carry it over into the classroom, and can we carry it over into the cafeteria, right? Those are important aspects of it. And then again, supports for school personnel. Who do we have supporting the staff? And I mean all the staff, not just speech, but all the staff, to make sure that everybody's doing the same thing, like the right way.
Absolutely. And I think that for our child that has an AAC device, I think it's really important to add in those additional times, even though it might not be that direct service with the student, but having that individual time designated for staff to get trained by, say, the SLP or the AAC person or the AT person, but then also have time in the IEP that's accounted for programming of the device, especially if school staff is the person. And I would designate one person. You don't want a case of too many cooks in the kitchen. I would say maybe the SLP or the teacher, one person, and the parents are kind of on board, and you kind of communicate, because I've had high school students, graduate, and then I see their device and now they're 24 and they still have like information about their morning jobs from high school still on their device because it was pre-programmed by their aide, because it was easier to get to, so they could just hit the button when they went to go pick up the recycling from all the teachers or something. And that's great. That's fun to be able to talk about that and to have easy access to it. But now you're an adult that's not functional to have. And then you get like random phrases, like specific like vocabulary for Hamlet on their homepage, and it replaced the word eat and stuff, like all kinds of crazy things. So I think too many cooks in the kitchen can be a little dangerous. We want everybody to be kind of know how to edit if they need to, but we want to make sure when edits are made, that people are communicating that. And that we're not necessarily moving things around, because that also impacts a child's kind of muscle memory of and their like language memory of where it was located in their system. So I think that that's something too, that designate that in there. I also think it's good to have a backup plan designated, because sometimes we can't have our device with us. Like if we're going to swim class, you're not taking your device in the pool. There's a good chance too that, little Elizabeth is not taking the device out on the slide when it's raining at recess, because they're still going, who knows? Maybe we have a light tech procedure there, because she still needs to be able to have data count, especially if she's making those communication attempts. We still want her to get that credit, get that data for those attempts, even if it's not the exact device. So we want those contingency plans in there, but I think also having a designated time in the child's IEP for programming or troubleshooting or training other teachers and staff about the device is also then going to ensure that that's actually happening too. Because it's really hard to update a device during your therapy session, because then you're not really doing one-to-one therapy, especially for children that really need to be actively engaged during that session, that they're busy, they're into everything, they can't wait those 2 seconds to program a device, because sometimes, or they're ready to touch it and they touch the screen and then you just lost everything that you edited. I think that that's stuff that's your kid, your students. Some of my students, I was able to program their device just with them and just be like, hey, wait a minute. Like, I'm getting you this word, wait a second. But then other kids, absolutely not. That would not have been good. And then I think even starting from kindergartners, thinking about what's going to happen when they graduate. They're going to go from elementary to middle school, middle to high school, and then they're going to graduate. What's going to happen to their communication system? And also, is their vocabulary, even though we're thinking about them as students, is their vocabulary growing with them? Because a lot of times, so this is the thing that I kind of, if you Google uncensored AAC, you're going to come up with videos of me talking about profanity. That is my area of expertise.
I just found that.
I'm the bad word lady. So profanity research and words for that, for like sexuality vocabulary, body parts. We will have students entering high school and they won't have words that go along that are more appropriate for a high school student. So we want to make sure that we're having those discussions with who's programming, making sure that that vocabulary is appropriate and meeting the needs of that child. So don't Google me.
I already did that. And I actually found that on YouTube. And I was like, oh, I really like it. But you know what? It is appropriate. Do you know what I mean? It is so appropriate, right? I mean, think about our language,
Yes.
you know?
And that even, it doesn't have to be like the F word or something like that. It can even be words like hate. I had a parent say, well, we don't use hate in our house, so I'm going to take it off the device. And I said, maybe we want, he's 15. Maybe we want to reconsider that, because what if somebody says that against him at school? He needs to be able to re- repeat this or notify staff of bullying or something like that. But we can still teach, you don't use that in our home, just like you would with, a sibling who uses their voice to communicate. You're still going to tell them, hey, knock it off. We don't say that. You can still say that to the child using AAC, because it's part of your human experience is learning when and when not to say things.
Yeah, you look at the neurotypical kids, right? And their language. I mean, I'm listening to 10, 12-year-old kids in the neighborhood and their language, right? And that's the F word. Not appropriate, don't like it, but it is what it is.
Children have a full repertoire of swear words by 11 to 12, whether they use them or not, they know.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely.
And I did have some examples again when you guys look through these slides too. These are now these curriculum things might be a little dated because I wrote this article maybe like a year and a half ago. So it might be a little worded different now, but these are examples of actually taking the curriculum standard from the state and then writing an AAC based goal. And these are goals that I would have personally written as an SLP for a student to work on in school. I tend to like kind of overarching topics that we can kind of apply to different concepts, because when we get too specific, then we're not actually like, because our goal is to use the AAC here and here and here and here, but using it throughout the day. But I still want to get that valuable data. So during a play activity, if we're using target core vocabulary, given a model, that means that, if you're a little one in preschool, kindergarten, most of your schooling is play-based. We're going to use those words like want and stop. I hit the word stop or go, or maybe we're playing with cars, and then the child selects stop and go. I'm seeing how many times that they're actually responding to that model and doing it themselves. So I think that there are a lot of really good ways to take this and then apply it to AAC type things. Other things I use is, even though the children might not be putting these long sentences together, that we can still build sentences or describe things like in the books, we're generating a 2-word or a 2-icon sequence. So with the device that they're pairing 2 icons together, maybe they're doing yellow and then the noun, color and the noun, or object and a verb, something like that. They're putting 2 things with their device together, and that can look different depending on the type of system somebody uses. It also can be easier to do depending on the type of system that the child uses as well. It just kind of depends. Sometimes we have to tweak and adjust these depending. So then I had some more myths. I feel like I talked all about these ones already. We give the child the device and they'll know how to use it. Probably not. They might not. It kind of goes into how developed your language is. If you're developing your language and learning your AAC, it might not be as easy to use. If you're an older child or a teenager and you have more advanced language skills, and you're more fluent in your English, it might be a little easier to navigate it too. If you have literacy skills, you might be able to kind of read those words. Otherwise, maybe you're learning the symbol correlations too. It really just depends on the child, but it's like the idea of learning a second language. We got to have exposure to it. We got to practice it to be able to be successful, and we got to see it being used. So that's where modeling comes into play. Teaching should only be done during the SLP's job or sessions. Nope, we want to make sure we're doing that all day, and only the child needs to know how to use the device. Everybody on the team should try their best to be able to use it, especially if the child will let you touch their device. Some kids don't, so we have to kind of get creative with how we're going to model and use it. But it's also good to teach them how to make mistakes on the device, because you're not going to know where all the words are. I don't know where all the words are on these devices. That's okay. Making mistakes is a really good way to teach children how to repair a breakdown. Implementation strategies. I think I've already mentioned all of these. We want to model on the device. We want to stay one step ahead. So if the child is our goal is for them to do one word, then as the adult or the communication partner, we're modeling 2 words, or we're expanding that idea of what they're saying. So if they're giving me a noun, maybe then I'm giving them a verb in the noun or an adjective in the noun. I'm expanding it. Again, it's okay to make mistakes, make things motivating. And we want to expand on that. Don't just request, comment on what you're doing. I've talked about modeling. I think I talked about this one. So the descriptive teaching method, I think this is kind of how we don't just apply like academic words. So especially for older students, we might be looking at like the special science words. And it is absolutely great to have children be exposed to those words. We want to make sure that they are. But then if we're kind of taking, like I kind of gave that example, we're replacing all of your important everyday words with Hamlet vocabulary all of a sudden, that's not very functional. And are you actually learning the concept, or are you just memorizing the new button on the page? So I think that we can still have access to these new words, still give students these new words, but then we also want to use their existing core vocabulary or their high frequency words to be able to describe these concepts, because then that also shows mastery of those academic concepts, that they truly understand what this word is, not that we're just hitting a muscle memory button. So this is just an example. So like the word pandemic, I might use the word sick and many and people and world to really talk about that concept. And then here's just some more examples too. And this is also going to help students to be able to use these words more creatively. So like one example is I might not, and I talk about this when I talk about profanity and things, I say like, we might not have the word abuse on the device, but we might be able to have the person be able to use the word hurt, like you hurt me bad, or big if we don't have the word bad. That can kind of get the point across, even though we don't have abuse on the device. So communication partner training, these are just some quick and easy tips for everybody, parents, teachers, other folks who are working with a student. We want to make sure we're giving them time. Using AAC does take longer than some other communication methods, especially when you're first getting started, or you're learning something new, or you're producing a longer sentence. So we want to make sure we're giving children time to give their response, and also time to process maybe what was asked of them or said. We want to honor all communication attempts. So if somebody's having a meltdown or a behavior or something, I might not make them say, okay, go grab the device and tell me you're mad. I might acknowledge that they're mad. And as the communication partner, I might model on the device that you're mad, but I'm not going to then say, okay, now tell me you're mad on the device. You're already telling me you're mad. That's not necessarily the time or place to do that. Because you're already communicating that. We don't want to make somebody repeat themselves. So we want to make sure we're kind of sabotaging the environment, structuring the environment to really give lots of good opportunities for communication, having AAC all day, every day, in routines as much as we can. It's also okay to sometimes put it down if we're getting upset and frustrated, because we also don't want it, especially for really young children, or if this is a really new concept to anybody, we don't want it to become work and then be frustrating, and because nobody wants to work. Communication shouldn't be hard. It should serve a purpose. It should also be motivating and social for us. We don't want it to be, oh no, not the device. So it's okay if we're taking a break, especially early on. And it's okay too, as a parent, to be like, oh my God, I'm overwhelmed. It's okay. We can always come back to it, but have it out. Doesn't mean it goes in the closet or something like that. It just put it away to the side for a couple minutes. And then of course, train others, model the AAC. That's going to be the best thing for the learner. And then this is basically the end. Meet me online. You are welcome to go to our TechOut website or shoot me an email. I'm happy to meet with anybody one-on-one to kind of talk through anything and everything in detail. And if I don't know the answer, there's a good chance somebody on my team will, or I can loop you into somebody who does. We're here to help. We're a free service. This is just the contact for the Institute. When you get a copy of the slides, if you want to take a chance to fill out the survey, you can. You don't have to. That just gives me information for our funders, but oh well. And then that's it. That's me.
Thank you. We are going to stop the recording now. So thank you. But what I'd like to do is also put up our final poll, just to get parental feedback.